night and day, 7 days a week. American steel furnaces never stop. Their products form the backbone of the nation's booming economy. Steel for countless consumer products. Steel to shield us against military aggression. Steel for our homes, offices, and national shrines. And when the steel industry announced price increases, it was important enough to involve the President of the United States.
The Bethlehem Steel Company this morning announced an across-the-board increase of almost 5% in steel mill products. If this action were followed by the rest of the steel industry, it would have dire economic consequences for our nation. The steel companies and the union reached a collective bargaining agreement yesterday. The terms of their settlement are high. That settlement will result in some increases in steel costs. But the announced Bethlehem price increase far exceeds any reasonable calculation of the cost of the wage settlement.
The warning from the White House was clear. Inflation in steel would be inflation for the nation. For a higher-priced ingot of steel would end up eventually as a higher-priced refrigerator or typewriter or wheelchair. Confronted with one of the largest single steel price increases since 1958, President Lyndon Johnson moved swiftly to ward off what he called this new virus of inflation. First, he asked his cabinet to hold up government purchases from steel companies whose new prices the administration regarded as unreasonable. Several members of the president's cabinet concerned with the steel situation conferred at the White House that morning. Mr. Johnson also consulted with his Council of Economic Advisors. The president then called key congressional leaders over to the cabinet room and explained the Johnson administration position. American taxpayers had just shouldered a multi-billion-dollar tax increase, said Mr. Johnson, and steel companies should also do their part to fight the specter of inflation. Next, Mr. Johnson took his case directly to representatives of private industries. We are hoping, said the president, that the steel companies will see how the national interest is at stake during this critical period. A few days later, Bethlehem and Inland Steel rolled back their price increase level to a more reasonable level of 2.5%. It was a major victory for the president and the administration. But with the country spared possibly $1 billion a year in inflation, the real victor was the American consumer. President Johnson began the month of August by going to the Department of Housing and Urban Development to sign into law the Housing Act of 1968. It was a historic occasion.
Today we're going to put on the books of American law what I genuinely believe is the most farsighted, the most comprehensive, the most massive housing program in American history. We cannot underwrite what can happen in the future. We already know how we have neglected matters in the past. But I do say that this legislation can be the Magna Carta to liberate our cities. It is vast in scope and vast in promise. With it, we now have new means to win new rights for every American in every city and every country road. And that new right is the fundamental and the very precious American right to a roof over your head, a decent home.
With the President's signature, a blueprint was laid out for the construction of 26 million new homes over the next decade. 6 million of these would replace all slum dwellings that now blight our cities and rural landscape. Among the 6,000 persons on hand for the ceremony were many distinguished leaders who had helped make this landmark legislation possible. But the President had special greetings for Mr. and Mrs. Lupe Arzola from Austin, Texas. For the Arzolas are residents in a neighborhood which started out as the first low-cost public housing project in the United States. It was inaugurated in 1938 under the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and with the vigorous backing of a certain young congressman, Lyndon B. Johnson.
The journey began more than 3 decades ago with President Franklin D. Roosevelt's conviction that a compassionate and far-sighted government cannot ignore the plight of the ill-housed, or the ill-fed, or the ill-clothed. First, there was the public housing experiments of the 1930s and 40s, led by that great adventurer Nathan Strauss in the Roosevelt administration. And I remember back in '38 when we met on a similar occasion to sign the Wagner Housing Act of 1938.
From the earliest days of his public career, Lyndon Johnson had sought better housing for all Americans. During the Fair Deal administration of Harry Truman, he had been instrumental in the enactment of the 1949 housing bill. And later, under the administration of Dwight Eisenhower, when Mr. Johnson was Senate Majority Leader, there were housing acts of the latter 50s. And all culminated in this multi-billion-dollar program to meet America's housing needs through the 1970s. The Department of Housing and Urban Development was one of the 2 new cabinet-level positions created during the Johnson administration in order to accommodate the needs of a growing population and a dynamic economy. Not far away on Independence Avenue is the new headquarters for the Department of Transportation, established in 1967. To this new arm of the federal government would fall the responsibility to administer the $12 billion federal highway bill, signed on August 23rd. The measure would extend interstate roads to a total of over 42,000 miles by 1974. It would deal more humanely than any previous program with the social effects of highway location, especially in American cities. But even as he signed the bill, President Johnson expressed his dissatisfaction with its weaknesses. It would seriously harm the effort to beautify America's highways and would dilute the nation's power to preserve parklands. Paralleling the expansion of our transportation system has been the growing network of natural gas pipelines, which already provide 1/3 of the nation's fuel needs. But with almost 1 million miles of gas lines threaded through heavy population centers coast to coast, the danger of devastating explosions has risen sharply. In August, President Johnson signed a bill directing the Secretary of Transportation to establish better safeguards for conveying natural gas into the homes of American consumers. The buying public was given another kind of protection when the President signed the Wholesome Poultry Products Act in August. The bill would extend federal inspection standards to poultry products sold within a state. It was just one of 17 laws passed during the Johnson administration to provide the consumer with better protection in the marketplace. The political, social, and economic rights of the people were things that Lyndon Johnson had always taken very seriously. The president told a National Bar Association convention in Washington of new and promising developments in the lives of Negroes in America.
Almost unnoticed, large numbers of American Negroes, for the first time in all American history, have now begun to enter the middle class. In 1962, the year before I became president, only 13% of the Negro families in America earned $8,000 a year. Last year, the percentage of Negroes at that income level of $8,000 had already more than doubled in our administration.
In summarizing his domestic goals at an annual meeting of the National Medical Association in Houston, Texas, President Johnson invoked Franklin D. Roosevelt's famous 4 freedoms. And to these, he added a 5th freedom.
A good job, a decent home, a good education, and justice for all. These are the new freedoms that we are working for today, that President Roosevelt eloquently referred to in his time. They are 4 spokes of a great wheel, and the 5th spoke, the great freedom, is the right of every American to as healthy a life as modern medicine can provide.
In August, a new Health Manpower Act was signed, boosting construction of medical schools and providing more scholarships for students seeking a career in medicine. Federal assistance for vital health programs for the American people now totaled $16 billion a year. A treasured moment for the President, Mrs. Johnson, and especially daughter Linda, gathered in the White House dining room to listen to the tape-recorded voice of Captain Charles Robb, telling of his personal experiences in Vietnam. In the same room a day later, the President heard reports on the course of the war from his National Security Council. On March 31st, the President had unilaterally stopped bombing over most of North Vietnam, but this had not met a similar restraint by Hanoi. On August 19th, Mr. Johnson told the annual convention of the Veterans of Foreign Wars in Detroit that he would take no further steps toward de-escalation of the war until North Vietnam made a move toward peace.
The United States took a major initiative toward peace on March 31st. We not only made an offer, but we immediately acted. We took a first dramatic step to de-escalate the conflict. I immediately ordered our aircraft and our naval vessels to make no attacks on North Vietnam north of the 20th parallel. And this excluded from bombing almost 90% of the North Vietnamese population and almost 80% of the North Vietnamese territory. And I then, that night, in that televised speech to the nation, had this to say, and I quote, "I cannot, in good conscience, stop all bombing so long as to do so would immediately and directly endanger the lives of our men and our allies." And whether a bombing halt becomes possible in the future will be determined by events. Thus far, Hanoi's response has been to reject every single suggestion made by ourselves or by others to de-escalate the conflict.
While at the gathering of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the President asked all those present to pray for the man whom he described as one of the great veterans of our time.
The hearts and the hopes of all of us in this room and of all our people across the entire United States go out at this moment to our beloved President, Dwight David Eisenhower. Ladies and gentlemen, I should like to ask each of you now to stand and to join me in a moment of silent prayer for this great, beloved American.
At Walter Reed Army Hospital, former President Eisenhower suffered his 7th heart attack and went on the critical list in August. But the general had never taken kindly to defeat. And when President and Mrs. Johnson visited him at Walter Reed Hospital, they found that he had rallied and was in good spirits. As Allied commander in World War II, one of the countries General Eisenhower helped liberate was Czechoslovakia, pushing Nazi tyranny from its boundaries. But just 23 years later, the Central European Republic was again ravaged by the forces of aggression. On August 20th, armies of the Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and East Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, seizing control of the country in a few hours. Soviet embassy lights burned late that hot and muggy evening in Washington. Even as Russian tanks rumbled into Prague, Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin called White House Special Assistant Walt Rostow to present Moscow's official reason for the invasion. The memorandum, which said that Soviet bloc forces had acted at the request of Czech leaders to safeguard the country against subversive elements, sounded hollow indeed. The next day, the president would condemn Soviet intervention on American television.
The tragic news from Czechoslovakia shocks the conscience of the world. The Soviet Union and its allies have invaded a defenseless country to stamp out a resurgence of ordinary human freedom. It is a sad commentary on the communist mind that a sign of liberty in Czechoslovakia is deemed a fundamental threat to the security of the Soviet system. The action of the Warsaw Pact allies is in flat violation of the United Nations Charter. We are consulting urgently with others to consider what steps should be undertaken in the United Nations. Meanwhile, in the name of mankind's hope for peace, I call on the Soviet Union and its associates to withdraw their troops from Czechoslovakia.
The president asked members of Congress to come back to Washington from their summer recess to brief them on the continuing Czechoslovakian crisis. The situation grew worse when there were rumors that the Soviet Union was now planning to strike at Romania and Yugoslavia, Balkan countries which had been condemned by Moscow for seeking closer ties with the West. Speaking before a gathering of dairymen in San Antonio, Texas, the president issued a clear warning.
It is clear to me that the leaders in Moscow have felt that their interests were threatened by the emergence of even modest degrees of national independence and human liberty in Eastern Europe. And in a tragic move, they have applied the full measure of military power in Czechoslovakia, where tonight hundreds of tanks surround that capital. And there are even rumors late this evening that this action might be repeated elsewhere in the days ahead in Eastern Europe. So I say to you tonight, we cannot and we must not, in the year 1968, return to a world of unbridled aggression. So let no one unleash the dogs of war.
Thus, in August, there were both wars and rumors of wars, which would often keep the President and his staff working deep into the night, seeking solutions to the problems of a divided world. For much of America, August is the time when summer reaches its peak. In Texas, it is the month when the harvest begins. '68 was a good year along the Pedernales, and the Johnsons were happy to be on hand at the LBJ Ranch for the harvest, and to spend as much time as possible relaxing with many friends and making arrangements for a special occasion. For this August was also the month when President Lyndon Johnson had reached his 60th birthday. The President watched the 1968 political conventions on television with his family and staff at the ranch. First, there was the Republican convention, held August 5th through the 8th at Miami, Florida. Not too long after Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew were nominated by Republicans for president and vice president, they were invited by Mr. Johnson to the ranch for a briefing on security problems. The man whom the Democrats would nominate as their standard bearer, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, was also at the LBJ Ranch in August, along with Mrs. Humphrey. Mr. Humphrey would soon be off for the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, August 26th through August 29th. Vice President Humphrey, in his acceptance speech, called for unity in his party. And he also paid warm tribute to the man who was still very much in the White House.
And what we are doing is in the tradition of Lyndon B. Johnson, who rallied a grief-stricken nation. Rallied a grief-stricken nation when our leader was stricken by the assassin's bullet, and said to you and said to me and said to all the world, let us continue. And in the space of 5 years since that tragic moment, President Johnson has accomplished more of the unfinished business of America than any of his modern predecessors. And I truly believe that history will surely record the greatness of his contribution to the people of this land. And tonight to you, Mr. President, I say thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thus, in a city which had witnessed scenes of tumult, a convention charged with emotion achieved its essential purpose, the nomination of its party's standard bearers. As August drew to a close, the most distinguished alumnus of Southwest Texas State College had come home. And although 38 graduating classes had passed from the campus since Lyndon Johnson worked his way through school by sweeping classrooms and cutting the grass, he still spoke a language which younger generations could understand.
Our system is not an easy one. In it, not every candidate, every viewpoint can win. And losing always hurts. It is a long and delicate process. Direct and indirect primaries, delegates, conventions, and elections. But one certainty cuts through all of these complexities. In the end, the American system is responsive to the people's will. The American system, never forget, reflects the wisdom of the majority of the American people. I look at you young people, and I know from what I see in your faces that we will not fail. You have the faith for the future. You have the faith for yourselves and your society and the American system that has given you so much and that now seeks a greater unity and a greater purpose of strength.